The glass vial felt lighter than a bullet, but Marta Edler knew it would kill more men than any rifle she had ever seen. July 18th, 1944, 2:47 in the morning, and her hands did not shake as she unscrewed the cap above the water drum. This moment would redefine the limits of civilian resistance in the Third Reich's final year and force us to confront an impossible question: when does a victim become a perpetrator? The field hospital at Kaufering, 23 kilometers west of Munich, operated in what had once been a textiles warehouse. The building still smelled of wool and machine oil beneath the sharper scents of carbolic acid and gangrene. Marta had arrived there 6 weeks earlier, conscripted like thousands of other women as Germany's medical system collapsed under the weight of casualties streaming back from the Eastern Front. She was 31 years old, a pharmacist's daughter from Munich's Schwabing district, with no nursing training and a 2-year-old son named Jakob, who no longer existed. The official records would later show that Jakob Edler died in the bombing of Munich on September 7, 1943, when Allied incendiaries turned the Schwabing neighborhood into an inferno that consumed 1,600 civilians in a single night. What the records could not show was that Jakob had been trapped in the basement shelter of their apartment building for 4 days before rescuers reached him, or that Marta had stood behind the cordons listening to the screams that eventually stopped, or that the SS officer who prevented her from climbing over the rubble to reach her child had smiled as he explained that regulations prohibited civilians from interfering with recovery operations. His name was Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Kessler. She learned this 3 weeks later when he arrived at the Kaufering hospital with shrapnel wounds from a partisan attack near Dachau. The field hospital treated primarily Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht personnel rotating through southern Bavaria. It was not a place for healing so much as sorting, deciding which men could be patched and returned to combat, which required evacuation to proper hospitals, and which would die regardless of intervention. Marta worked in the pharmacy, a converted storage room where she prepared dressings, counted morphine ampules, and mixed the endless solutions required to keep wounded men alive long enough to die elsewhere. She had been competent, even diligent, until the night of July 15th, when she was sent to deliver medication to the officers' ward and found Hauptsturmführer Kessler sitting up in bed, smoking a cigarette, very much alive. He did not recognize her. Why would he? She had been just another hysterical woman behind the cordons that night, one of hundreds. But she recognized the iron cross at his collar, the particular shade of his hair, mouse brown, and the way his mouth moved when he gave orders to the young nurse, changing his bandages. That same mechanical smile. The recognition brought clarity rather than rage. Rage, she had learned, was a luxury. What replaced it was colder, more patient, a calculation. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this story makes you think, hit that like button and subscribe. We're uncovering histories that demand to be remembered. The pharmacy at Kaufering kept its poison cabinet in a metal locker behind the main dispensary. The key hung on a ring with 11 others, all meticulously labeled, all accessible to senior staff during night shifts when the chief pharmacist was absent. Marta had been given a full set in her 3rd week, a gesture of trust born from desperate understaffing rather than confidence in her abilities. Sodium cyanide came in brown glass bottles, each containing 250 grams of white crystalline powder. The hospital used it primarily for developing X-ray films, though wartime shortages meant supplies were irregular. On July 16th, inventory showed 3 bottles in stock. On July 17th, after Marta's shift, inventory showed 2. The missing bottle weighed nothing in her apron pocket. She worked through the next day with mechanical precision, her hands steady as she prepared sulfur powder and counted out precious penicillin doses for men who would never leave Bavaria alive. Kessler remained in the officers' ward, healing well, joking with the nurses about his eagerness to return to his unit near Dachau. In 5 days, the doctor estimated, he would be discharged. She had 4 days to make her decision, or so she told herself. What makes a person cross the final line? Is it a single moment, or the accumulation of 10,000 smaller cruelties that finally tips the scale? Marta Edler would later, much later in testimony given under very different circumstances, describe those 4 days as the calmest of her life since Jakob's death. She had purpose. She had clarity. She had, for the first time in months, control. But control over what exactly? The field hospital at Kaufering treated between 40 and 60 patients at any given time, with staff rotating in 8-hour shifts. The water supply came from municipal lines but was stored in 4 large drums, each holding roughly 200 liters, positioned throughout the facility. One drum in the surgery preparation room, one in the officers' ward, one in the enlisted men's quarters, and one in the staff kitchen. The drums were refilled weekly, sanitized monthly, and critical to operations in a building where running water was unreliable due to Allied bombing damage to city infrastructure. Marta had access to all of them. On the night of July 17th, she worked the midnight to 8 shift alongside 2 other nurses and an elderly doctor who spent most of his time in surgery. The corridors were quiet, except for occasional cries from patients dreaming or dying. At 2:47 in the morning, she would remember the exact time because she checked the pharmacy clock 3 times, she carried her medical bag to the officer's ward on the pretext of delivering sleeping medication. 10 men slept in that ward. Kessler occupied the bed nearest the window, snoring slightly, his bandaged shoulder pale against white sheets. The water drum stood in the corner, ceramic and unremarkable. She unstoppered it. The cyanide dissolved instantly, invisible, odorless, betraying nothing of its presence, except for the faint, bitter almond scent that only some people could detect, and Marta was not one of them. She replaced the stopper, returned to the pharmacy, completed her shift. But here's what the testimony would never fully explain. Why didn't she stop there? The officers' ward held 10 men, including Kessler. That would have been vengeance enough, targeted, almost surgical in its precision. Yet over the next 90 minutes, Marta visited 3 more drums, the enlisted ward, the surgery prep room, the staff kitchen. She emptied the entire bottle, 250 grams divided among 4 drums, enough cyanide to kill hundreds. Dawn found her scrubbing her hands in the pharmacy sink, watching pink soap foam spiral down the drain, thinking about Jakob's small hands and how they had looked the last time she saw them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because when the sun rose over Kaufering on July 18, 1944, Marta Edler walked out of that hospital into a morning that looked exactly like any other. She stopped at the market for bread. She nodded to neighbors. She acted precisely as a woman with nothing to hide would act. Behind her, the water drums waited, and the men, so terribly thirsty in the July heat, began their morning routines. The first man to die did so quietly, slumped over a breakfast tray at 6:38 in the morning, his fingers still wrapped around a tin cup. What followed would force German military authorities to confront an enemy they had never prepared for, one who wore their own uniform and knew exactly where they were vulnerable. Obergefreiter Hans Folter had been recovering from a leg wound sustained near Minsk. 22 years old, a baker's son from Cologne, he had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, only to die in a Bavarian hospital from a drink of water. The nurse who found him initially assumed he had simply fallen asleep sitting up, a common enough sight in a ward full of exhausted men, but when she tried to rouse him, his skin felt wrong, too cool. His lips had taken on a curious cherry-red color that she could not explain. By 7:15, 3 more men in the enlisted ward were convulsing. By 7:45, the officers' ward had erupted into chaos that no amount of medical training could contain. The symptoms arrived with brutal efficiency. Headaches first, sudden and crushing, then dizziness, confusion, rapid breathing. The men described a metallic taste, a burning sensation in their throats. Some vomited, others simply collapsed. The cherry-red lips appeared on nearly all of them, a distinctive cyanosis that made their faces look almost healthy even as their bodies shut down. Hauptsturmführer Kessler made it to the corridor before his legs gave out. He died on the tile floor, calling for his mother, while a nurse 20 years his junior held his hand and had no idea what was killing him. The chief physician, Dr. Albrecht Reinmann, had served in the First World War and had seen gas attacks at Ypres. He recognized poisoning within minutes of entering the enlisted ward, but recognition is not the same as solution. There was no antidote, no treatment protocol, no procedure that could reverse what was already happening in the bodies of men who had simply been thirsty. By 8:30 in the morning, 17 men were dead. 23 more were dying. Another 12 showed symptoms that suggested they would join them. 42 casualties from breakfast. The investigation began before the last body stopped twitching. Military police arrived from Munich at 9:47, led by Major Otto Brenner, a career Kripo detective conscripted into Wehrmacht security. He walked through the hospital with a handkerchief pressed to his nose, not from squeamishness but because someone had suggested gas, and old habits die hard. What he found instead was far more disturbing than gas. The water drums. Dr. Reinmann's staff had already made the connection. Every victim had drunk from hospital water sources that morning. No one who had avoided the drums, who had brought water from home or coffee or nothing at all, showed any symptoms. The pattern was absolute, damning, and terrifying in its implications. Major Brenner ordered immediate testing. A dog was brought from the military kennels, given water from the officer's ward drum. The animal died in 4 minutes, thrashing and foaming. Chemical analysis rushed through a laboratory in Munich confirmed what Brenner already suspected: sodium cyanide, massive quantities, dissolved throughout the hospital's water supply. This was not an accident. This was not carelessness. This was deliberate, calculated mass murder carried out by someone with access, knowledge, and motive. The question that paralyzed the investigation in those first hours was simple and impossible. Who would kill their own side? Marta Edler reported for her shift at 4 o'clock that afternoon. She had spent the day in her apartment, reading to the empty chair where Jakob used to sit, listening to the sirens in the distance, waiting. When she walked through the hospital entrance, she found a facility transformed. Military police at every door, staff being questioned in groups, the water drums removed, empty spaces marking where they had stood like missing teeth. A young officer stopped her in the corridor. "Papers," he demanded. "Identity documents. Why was she here?" "She was scheduled to work," she explained, her voice steady. "She worked in the pharmacy. Did they need her statement?" Of course, the officer said everyone would need to provide statements, but first, had she been on duty last night? "Yes," she said, midnight to 8. She had left at her normal time. Had she noticed anything unusual? Anyone accessing the water supply? She thought carefully before answering. "No," she said, "nothing unusual, just a quiet night, the usual checks." She'd been in the pharmacy mostly, preparing tomorrow's medications. The officer made notes. She was dismissed, for now. Report to the administrative office within the hour for formal questioning. Marta walked to the pharmacy. The metal locker where the poison had been stored stood open, its contents catalogued across a nearby table. 2 bottles of sodium cyanide remain. Someone had already noticed the discrepancy. A junior pharmacist was frantically checking requisition logs, trying to account for the missing container. She glanced up as Marta entered. "Thank God you're here," the woman said, her face pale. "They're saying someone stole cyanide from our pharmacy. Do you know anything about inventory from last week?" Marta moved to the dispensary counter, reaching for the logbook with hands that did not shake. "Let me check the records," she said. "When was the last full inventory?" "July 15th, the woman said. "Friday. You were on shift that day, weren't you?" "Yes," Marta confirmed. She had been. She flipped through pages, her finger tracing columns of numbers that suddenly felt meaningless, the mathematics of murder, reduced to ledger lines. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear Major Brenner's voice echoing from the corridor. He was organizing the investigation with Prussian efficiency. Lock down the facility, question everyone, check backgrounds, find the person with motive and opportunity. He was looking for a partisan, he announced, a communist infiltrator, someone with connections to the resistance networks known to operate around Dachau. He was looking for someone who made sense. What he would not find, could not conceive of, was a mother with nothing left to lose. The formal interrogations began at 6 o'clock. Staff were questioned alphabetically, which gave Marta 3 hours. She used them efficiently. First, the pharmacy records. She helped the junior pharmacist discover an error in the July 15th inventory, suggesting the missing bottle had been transferred to another facility weeks earlier. Administrative confusion, easy to believe in wartime chaos. Second, she volunteered additional information to a passing MP. She had seen an orderly near the officer's ward around 3 in the morning, someone she did not recognize. Dark hair, medium build, just a glimpse, probably nothing, but shouldn't they check the orderly rosters? By the time her name was called for questioning, 3 other staff members had mentioned suspicious orderlies. Unfamiliar faces, possible security breaches. The investigation was already fragmenting, chasing shadows she had not even intentionally created. Major Brenner sat behind a requisitioned desk in what had been the hospital director's office. He looked tired. 52 men dead now. The number kept rising as delayed symptoms claimed men who had drunk less, survived longer, but could not ultimately be saved. "Fräulein Edler," he began, consulting his notes. "You work in the pharmacy." "Yes, sir." "You have access to the poison cabinet." "Yes, sir," along with 4 other staff members. "Were you aware that sodium cyanide was missing from inventory?" "Not until today," she said. "I helped check the records this afternoon. It appears the bottle was transferred to Dachau on July 15th. Brenner's eyes narrowed. "That transfer is not confirmed." "No, sir, but it's noted in our logs." A lie so small, so plausible, so buried in bureaucratic minutiae that proving its falsehood would take days, and she could see in Brenner's face that he did not have days. He had orders to find the perpetrator immediately before panic spread, before other hospitals became targets, before the civilian population learned that even military medical facilities were no longer safe. "Tell me about last night," he said. "Your shift, every detail." So she did. She told him about the quiet corridors, the sleeping patients, the routine checks. She told him about the orderly she had glimpsed. She told him everything except the truth. And she told it so well that Brenner dismissed her after 20 minutes with instructions to remain available for further questioning. Marta walked out of that office knowing she had perhaps 12 hours before the investigation tightened, before someone noticed an inconsistency, before the net closed. She went home. She packed a small bag, food, clothing, Jakob's photograph. She walked to the Hauptbahnhof and purchased a ticket to Stuttgart using money she had been saving for nothing in particular. And at 23 minutes past midnight, on July 19th, 1944, she boarded a train heading west. Behind her, Major Brenner was interrogating a Hungarian orderly who happened to have dark hair and medium build, who could not adequately account for his movements during the night shift, who would be arrested within 6 hours and held for 3 weeks before finally being released when the evidence refused to support the narrative. Ahead of her lay the Black Forest, partisan territory, and a choice that would define everything that came after. Because vengeance, as Marta was about to discover, has a long shadow, and hers had barely begun to fall. The Black Forest earned its name not from darkness, but from the density of fir trees so thick that sunlight never reached the forest floor, and in August 1944, it concealed networks of resistance that German authorities pretended did not exist. What Marta found there would transform her from fugitive into something far more dangerous, a symbol that threatened the Reich's carefully maintained fiction of internal security. The train to Stuttgart had been her first mistake. Too direct, too obvious, too much like a plan. She realized this at dawn on July 19th, when she disembarked at a small station outside Pforzheim and watched Gestapo officers boarding the Stuttgart-bound cars, checking papers, asking questions. She had left the train one stop early on instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 9 months of bombing raids, through Jakob's death, through 6 weeks of working alongside the men she had poisoned. Instinct and luck. But luck has a way of running out. Pforzheim sat at the northern edge of the Black Forest, a jewelry-making town that had not yet been reduced to rubble but would be within 7 months, though Marta could not know this as she walked away from the station with her small bag and no destination. What she knew was that she could not go west toward Stuttgart, could not return east toward Munich, could not stay in any town where papers would be checked and questions asked. So she went south, into the trees, where the roads became paths and the paths became suggestions, and finally disappeared altogether. The forest swallowed her by mid-morning. The temperature dropped 10 degrees beneath the canopy. The air smelled of pine resin and decomposing needles and something else. Wood smoke, faint and distant. Someone was burning something, which meant someone was there, which meant she was not alone. She found the first partisan camp by accident 3 days later, half dead from thirst and completely lost. Or perhaps the camp found her. A woman emerged from behind an oak tree, just appeared, as if she had been part of the bark itself, and pressed a knife to Marta's throat before she could scream. "Papers!" the woman hissed in French-accented German. Marta had left her papers on the train, deliberately. She had become no one, which was either the smartest thing she had ever done or the last mistake she would ever make. "I don't have papers," Marta said. "I'm running from the police." "Everyone is running from the police," the woman said. "What did you do?" The question hung between them like smoke. What had she done? How did you explain 52 deaths in a sentence? How did you make a stranger understand that murder can be justice, that poison can be mercy, that sometimes the only power left to the powerless is the power to destroy? "I killed German soldiers," Marta said. 52 of them, at a hospital in Kaufering. The knife lowered, just slightly. The woman's eyes narrowed. "The poisoning," she said. "We heard about it on the radio. They said it was partisans. They said it was us." "It was me." The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Come," she said, "you need to meet Jacques." Vengeance requires no permission, only opportunity. The partisan network in the Black Forest consisted of approximately 200 active fighters, French forced laborers who had escaped from factories, German deserters, a handful of Jews from camps whose names were whispered but never spoken aloud, and political prisoners who had somehow survived when they should not have. They operated in cells of 10 to 20, moving constantly, supplied by sympathetic farmers, and coordinated by a former French army officer who went by the name Jacques and was probably not French at all. Jacques received her in a clearing, where 3 streams converged, the sound of running water making conversation difficult to overhear. He was perhaps 40, lean as wire, with eyes that had stopped registering surprise years earlier. "Tell me what you did," he said. "Every detail." So she did. For the second time in 4 days, Marta recounted the night of July 17th, But this time she told the truth. The poison cabinet, the water drums, the deliberate calculation that had led her to contaminate not just one ward but 4. She told him about Kessler, about Jakob, about the 9 months since the bombing that had felt like drowning in slow motion. When she finished, Jacques was quiet for a long time. Around them, the forest continued its ancient business, birds calling, insects humming, the streams running toward rivers that would eventually reach the Rhine. "You killed 52 men to kill one," he finally said. "Yes. That is not justice, that is massacre." "Yes." He stood, paced to the stream edge, stood with his back to her. When he turned, his expression had hardened into something like respect or horror, she could not tell which. "Do you understand what you have done?" he asked. "The reprisals will be extraordinary. They will burn villages, hang hostages. You have given them justification for atrocities they wanted to commit anyway." "I know," Marta said. And she did. She had known from the moment she unscrewed the first drum that she was not just killing Kessler, not just killing soldiers. She was lighting a fuse whose explosion would consume innocence, would justify brutality, would give the regime exactly what it needed to tighten its grip. She had known, and she had done it anyway, because sometimes the calculation is not about minimizing harm. Sometimes it is about making them feel, just once, just for a moment, the fear that you have felt every day since your world ended. Jacques seemed to understand this without her saying it. He nodded slowly. "You cannot stay here," he said. "You are too valuable and too dangerous. The Gestapo is hunting you. If they find this camp because of you, everyone dies. Then I'll leave." "No," he said. "You will not leave. You will disappear." Over the next 6 weeks, Marta learned what it meant to truly disappear. The partisans moved her between safe houses, a barn in Freudenstadt, a monastery outside Villingen, a hunting lodge so remote that its owner had not seen another human in 3 years. She was given new clothes, peasant clothing that smelled of earth and sweat. Her hair was cut short, then dyed darker. She was taught to move through the forest without sound, to recognize German patrol patterns, to distinguish between the crack of a hunting rifle and the sharper report of military weapons. She was also given choices. Jacques visited her in early September at the monastery, bringing news that felt like a test. "The hospital poisoning has become propaganda," he told her. "Goebbels is using it to justify increased security measures. They have arrested 47 people in Bavaria. 8 have been executed. The investigation continues." "Have they found the orderly?" Marta asked. "The Hungarian?" "Released 3 weeks ago. They know it was not him. They know it was someone with pharmacy access. They have narrowed the list to 7 people." 7 names, 7 lives hanging in the balance because Marta had chosen vengeance over precision. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. "I want you to understand what you started," Jacques said. "And I want to know if you are willing to continue." The offer was simple. Stay with the partisans, use her pharmaceutical knowledge for their operations, help them, fight with them, or leave, try to survive alone, accept that her moment of rebellion had been exactly that, a moment, finite and complete. Marta took 3 days to decide. During those 3 days, news reached the monastery that Major Otto Brenner had been killed in an Allied bombing raid on Munich. The man who had questioned her, who had nearly found her, was gone, erased by a coincidence that felt like providence or mockery or both. On the 4th day, she told Jacques, yes, they called her Die Apothekerin, the pharmacist, and for the next 7 months she became the partisan network specialist in silent warfare. She taught them which common plants could be rendered toxic, which medications could be stolen and repurposed, which chemical combinations would incapacitate without killing. She never used cyanide again, could not bring herself to touch it, but she found other ways to make the Reich bleed in small, untraceable cuts. She poisoned water supplies at Wehrmacht barracks, causing mass dysentery. She contaminated fuel supplies with sugar and sand. She showed partisans how to render medical supplies useless through subtle contamination that would not be noticed until soldiers were already depending on them in combat. And she never killed another person directly. This was her rule, her line, the moral boundary she constructed in the ruins of her former self. She would enable death, facilitate it, make it more likely, but she would not poison another water drum, would not repeat Kaufering, would not again wake up to news of men dying by the dozens from her hand. Whether this distinction mattered is a question philosophers can debate. To Marta, it was everything. But the Reich was collapsing, and collapse breeds chaos. And in chaos, rules become impossible to maintain. By March 1945, the Black Forest partisans knew the war was ending. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. Soviet armies were driving toward Berlin. The only question was how much blood would be spilled in the final weeks. How many desperate acts the regime would commit before accepting inevitable defeat. And then Jacques received intelligence that changed everything. A hospital train would be passing through Pforzheim on March 23rd, carrying wounded SS officers from the Western Front to Munich Not a military target by Geneva Convention standards. Not soldiers going to combat, but soldiers leaving it. Jacques wanted to derail it anyway. Symbolic, he said. A message. Marta said no. They argued for 2 hours in a farmhouse kitchen while spring rain drummed against the windows. She had killed 52 men, Jacques reminded her. What difference did 30 more make? She had already crossed the line. She had already chosen violence. This was just continuation, just logic, just war. But Marta held firm. The hospital in Kaufering had been personal, specific, targeted at one man, and accidentally catching 51 others in its net. The train would be pure slaughter, calculated and cold, and she would not help him do it. She thought that would be the end of it. She thought Jacques would accept her refusal and move on to another plan. She did not know that he had already made arrangements without her, that the explosives were already in place, that her opinion had been a courtesy rather than a consultation. On March 23rd, 1945, at 9:40 in the morning, the hospital train exploded 3 kilometers outside Pforzheim. 47 men died. 12 survived with injuries that would require amputation, blindness, permanent disfigurement. And Marta, who learned about it that evening from a partisan courier, finally understood that she had not escaped Kaufering at all. She had simply expanded its boundaries to include everything she touched. Marta walked away from the partisan camp on March 24th, 1945, carrying nothing but Jakob's photograph and a question she could not answer. How many deaths does one murdered child justify? Her story did not end that day. But the woman who had poisoned Kaufering did, replaced by someone who understood that vengeance is not a debt that can ever be fully paid. The roads leading west were clogged with refugees fleeing the approaching Allied armies. German civilians who had spent 6 years supporting conquest now fled its consequences, pushing handcarts loaded with possessions they would abandon within days. Marta joined them, just another faceless woman in a column of the dispossessed, invisible in the great migration that marked the Reich's final collapse. She did not speak, she did not explain, she simply walked. By April 1st, she had reached the French occupation zone near Freiburg. By April 15th, Hitler's last birthday, though no one was celebrating, she had found work in a displaced persons camp run by French military authorities. They needed translators, administrators, anyone who could help process the thousands of refugees flooding across the border. They did not ask too many questions. Everyone had secrets in the spring of 1945. Everyone was running from something. Marta gave them a false name, Anna Weber from Dresden, a widow whose papers had been lost in the bombing. They accepted this without question. Why wouldn't they? Half the women in the camp claimed to be from Dresden. It was a convenient fiction, a city so thoroughly destroyed that verifying anything was impossible. She worked there for 6 weeks, sorting the living from the dying, the salvageable from the lost. And every day she thought about the hospital train. 47 men who would have lived if she had stopped Jacques. 47 deaths that sat on top of the 52 from Kaufering, forming a pile of bodies she could no longer justify. 99 lives for one child. The mathematics refused to balance. On May 8th, Germany surrendered. Church bells rang across France. Displaced persons wept with relief. Marta felt nothing. Jakob was still dead. Kessler was still dead. The 98 others were still dead. Victory changed none of this. What victory did change was the investigation. With the war over, Allied authorities began sorting through German records, documenting crimes, preparing for tribunals. The Kaufering poisoning file, incomplete, scattered, but still extant, made its way to American counterintelligence officers in Munich. They were not looking for Marta specifically. They were looking for patterns, for networks, for partisan operations that might explain dozens of similar incidents across southern Germany. What they found was an anomaly, a massacre without clear partisan signature, a poisoning too personal to be strategic, too calculated to be opportunistic. Special Agent Robert Henshaw, formerly of the FBI, now attached to the OSS, read the file in June 1945 and immediately recognized what German investigators had missed. This was not resistance activity. This was personal. The target was not military infrastructure, it was specific men, and the perpetrator had pharmacy access, which narrowed the suspect pool to 7 people. 5 of those 7 had been cleared or were dead. That left 2. Henshaw found the first, a 63-year-old pharmacist named Klaus Dietz, living in a basement in Munich, half-starved, traumatized by months of interrogation under German custody. He had not poisoned anyone. He barely remembered his own name. The second name was Marta Edler. Her file was thin. Age 31, widowed, 1 child, deceased. Worked at Kaufering from June through July 1944. Disappeared on July 19th, hours after the poisoning. Never found. Henshaw put out inquiries. Did anyone match this description in the displaced persons camps? French occupation authorities checked their records. On July 9, 1945, they sent a telegraph. Possible match at Camp Freiburg. Woman calling herself Anna Weber, age and physical description consistent. Henshaw arrived on July 12th with 2 French officers and a translator. They found Marta in the camp's administrative tent, processing ration cards for Hungarian Jews. She looked up as they entered, saw their uniforms, and knew. She did not run. There was nowhere left to run to. "Fräulein Edler?" Henshaw asked in careful German. "Yes," she said. Just that. No denial, no explanation, just acknowledgement. They arrested her quietly, without drama. The French officers were almost apologetic. The Hungarian Jews she had been helping watched in silence as she was led away, and Marta wondered what they thought, whether they understood that the woman who had given them food and processed their paperwork was also a mass murderer, and whether that distinction even mattered anymore. The interrogation took place in a converted school building in Freiburg. Henshaw asked her to tell him everything. So, for the 3rd time, and the last, Marta recounted the night of July 17th, 1944. She told him about Jakob, about Kessler, about the water drums and the cyanide and the decision to poison not just one ward but all of them. She told him things she had told no one else, how she had gone home that night and slept peacefully for the first time in months, how she had felt clean finally, as if Jakob's death had been acknowledged in the only language the Reich understood. "You killed 52 men," Henshaw said when she finished. 52 that I'm certain of," Marta corrected. "There may have been more, men who died later from smaller doses. I don't know the final count." "And the train, the hospital train in March?" She explained about Jacques, about the partisans, about her refusal to help, and the bombing that happened anyway. Henshaw took notes in a small leather book, his expression unreadable. "Did you regret it?" he finally asked. "The poisoning." Marta thought about this carefully. It was the most important question anyone had asked her. "I regret 51 of them," she said, "every day. But not Kessler. No, not Kessler. Never Kessler." Henshaw closed his notebook. He looked at her across the scarred wooden table that separated them. This woman who had committed one of the war's stranger atrocities, who fit no category, who could not be easily condemned or easily forgiven. "You understand you'll be tried," he said. "Probably by German courts. Once they're reconstituted, this was a crime against German soldiers." "I understand. You'll likely hang?" "I understand that too. But that's not what happened." History bends in unexpected ways, particularly in the chaos of transition. By August 1945, Allied authorities faced bigger problems than a single poisoning incident. The camps, the war crimes trials, the complete reconstruction of German civil society. Marta's case file moved from desk to desk, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, each authority concluding that someone else should handle it. The German courts had not been reconstituted. The American military courts were focused on high-ranking Nazis. The French occupation authorities had more pressing matters. And Henshaw, who might have pushed the case forward, was reassigned to Japan in September. Marta remained in custody, technically, but that custody became increasingly theoretical. By November, she was working again, this time in a hospital treating concentration camp survivors. The Americans needed anyone with medical training. They did not have the luxury of moral purity. In January 1946, her case file was misfiled under pending review and forgotten. In March 1946, she was quietly released. She never stood trial. She was never formally charged. The woman who had killed 52 men, potentially 99 if you counted the train, simply disappeared into the machinery of post-war reconstruction, became one more displaced person in a continent of displaced persons, one more story swallowed by larger tragedies. She took the name Anna Weber permanently. She worked in hospitals in Munich, Stuttgart, and finally Hamburg, always in recovery wards, always with the most damaged patients, always giving more than the job required. She never married. She never had another child. She lived quietly, carefully, a life of deliberate smallness that might have been penance, or might simply have been exhaustion. She died in Hamburg in 1973 at the age of 60 from pneumonia. Her obituary listed no survivors. Her possessions fit in a single box: clothing, a few books, and a photograph of a small boy with dark hair and his mother's eyes. The photograph was the only thing she had carried from that night in July 1944 to her death 3 decades later. On the back, in handwriting that had faded but never disappeared, were 3 words: "For Jakob, always." The story should end there, but stories rarely end where we want them to. In 1987, a German historian named Werner Schulz was researching partisan activity in Bavaria when he stumbled across the Kaufering file. He spent 3 years tracking down survivors, interviewing witnesses, piecing together what had happened. In 1990, he published a book, Die Apothekerin von Kaufering, The Pharmacist of Kaufering. The book caused a sensation. Here was a war crime that defied categories. A woman who killed German soldiers but was not a partisan, who committed mass murder but had undeniable justification, who escaped justice but seemed to have punished herself more severely than any court could have. Historians debated her legacy. Ethicists used her case in discussions of proportionate response. Germans of her generation, particularly women who had lost children in the bombing campaigns, saw in her story a mirror of their own suppressed rage. But perhaps the most telling response came from Jakob Kessler, the son of Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Kessler, born 4 months after his father's death. In 1991, at the age of 47, Jakob Kessler gave an interview to Der Spiegel. He had read Schultz's book. He had learned how his father died, and he said this: "I cannot forgive what she did. Those 51 other men, they had families, children, mothers who wept for them, but I also cannot condemn her completely. My father helped kill her child through indifference, through bureaucratic cruelty. If someone had done that to my son, what would I have done? I want to say I would have been better, more controlled, but I honestly don't know." That uncertainty, that inability to answer, is perhaps the only honest response to Marta's story. She committed an atrocity. She also suffered one. She took lives that did not deserve to be taken, but she did so because her own life had been destroyed by men who believed rules did not apply to them. She became what she fought against, but only after everything else had been taken from her. There is no resolution here, no moral that ties everything neatly together. There is only the question that Marta herself never answered. When the machinery of cruelty crushes your entire world, when the systems meant to protect you instead enable your destruction, when the men who murdered your child face no consequences, what then? What do you do with grief so absolute that it burns away everything except the need to make them understand what they have taken? Marta Edler chose poison. 52 men died, and in the decades since, we have tried to decide whether she was a victim, a perpetrator, a war criminal, a resistance fighter, or simply a woman who discovered that vengeance, once begun, can never satisfy the hunger that drives it. Perhaps she was all of these, perhaps she was none, perhaps she was simply human, which is to say, capable of both unimaginable suffering and unforgivable acts, sometimes existing in the same moment, the same heart, the same trembling hands that unscrewed a cap above a water drum and changed nothing except the count of the dead. The vial was lighter than a bullet, but its weight has never stopped growing.